The airplane is the only weapon in the world that kills its creator faster than the enemy. Not because it is poorly made, but because every time aviation did something for the very first time, it did so without rules. The rules came later. After burning bombers crashed into English fields, after aircraft carriers exploded from their own ammunition, after anti-aircraft missiles shot down the very people they were supposed to protect. The history of military aviation is a history of people who flew where no one had ever flown before, and paid a price so steep it changed everything. Today, we look at 10 disasters that forced the world to rewrite the military manuals. Story 1. Pearl Harbor, Oahu, December 7th, 1941. At 7:02 a.m., Private Joseph Lockard sat in front of the oscilloscope at the Opana radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, looking at something he had never seen before. A pulse appeared on the screen, so wide and high that he initially thought the equipment was broken. Lockard was on duty with Private George Elliott. Both were privates, both were green, but both understood they were looking at something massive. Lockard called the information center at Fort Shafter. The phone was answered by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the only officer on shift on his second day on the job. Lockard explained, "A huge group of planes is approaching from the north, 88 miles away. It's the largest signal I've ever seen." Tyler listened and replied, "Don't worry about it." He assumed it was a flight of B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive from the mainland. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese planes appeared over Pearl Harbor. By the end of the attack, 21 ships were sunk or crippled. 188 aircraft were destroyed, mostly on the ground, and 2,403 Americans were dead. The radar had detected the threat 53 minutes before the first explosion. 53 minutes. Enough time to scramble fighters. Enough time to disperse the ships. Enough time to change everything. The rule. The rule that entered military manuals worldwide after Pearl Harbor, and hasn't changed since. Any radar signal that does not have a definitive explanation is considered a threat until proven otherwise. The duty officer must immediately pass the information up the chain of command, not interpret it themselves. Lieutenant Tyler didn't break a single active regulation that day, because the regulations simply didn't exist yet. They came later. Story 2. Bekaa Valley, Bekaa Valley, June 1982. By the summer of 1982, the Syrian Air Force possessed one of the most formidable Soviet-made air defense systems in the Middle East. 19 surface-to-air missile batteries, heavily protected by fighter jets. The Syrian command was confident. Israeli aviation could not operate in this airspace without catastrophic losses. On June 9, 1982, Israel launched an operation that military analysts would later call a revolution in warfare. First, drones took to the sky, small, cheap, made of plywood and plastic. Syrian operators saw the blips on their radar screens and activated their targeting systems to destroy them. At that exact moment, Israeli electronic warfare aircraft recorded the precise frequencies of every single Syrian radar and transmitted them to their strike groups. What followed took less than 2 hours. Anti-radiation missiles wiped out the batteries one by one. Syrian fighter jets scrambled to intercept, only to fly right into the sights of Israeli fighters, guided by AWACS planes that saw the entire battlefield in real time. In 2 days, Syria lost 82 aircraft. Israel lost 0. The rule. This battle changed aviation doctrine as radically as the Battle of Cambrai changed tank warfare. The rule that became standard for all modern armies. An aviation operation does not begin with a strike. It begins with suppression. Radars and command systems must be destroyed first, and only then do strike aircraft enter the airspace. No modern air operation is planned without an electronic warfare phase. The Syrians paid for this lesson with 82 machines. The rest of the world learned it for free. Story 3. Top Gun. Vietnam, 1965 to 1968. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. military was convinced that the era of close-range dogfights was over. New air-to-air missiles could hit targets from dozens of miles away. The machine gun on a fighter jet was considered a relic of the past. The new F-4 Phantom was designed as a long-range interceptor, massive, fast, and packed with electronics. It didn't even have a gun. Over the skies of Vietnam, theory brutally clashed with reality. Rules of engagement forbade firing missiles without visual identification. This meant a pilot had to get close enough to see if the aircraft was friend or foe. At that close range, long-range missiles were useless. The Phantom found itself nose-to-nose with the MiG-17, a small, highly maneuverable jet armed with cannons, and the Phantom lost. By 1968, the kill-to-loss ratio for U.S. fighters was 2.5 to 1, the worst performance since World War II. The U.S. Navy lost over 530 aircraft in dogfights and 644 pilots killed, missing, or captured. In 1968, Captain Frank Alt was tasked with finding out why the best fighters in the world were losing to outdated Soviet machines. His report was hundreds of pages long, but the main conclusion fit into one sentence. The pilots weren't taught how to fight. They were taught to intercept in a straight line from a distance. Nobody taught them close-quarters dogfighting. In 1969, in an old trailer at Miramar Air Base in California, 8 officers under the command of Dan Peterson started writing a training program from scratch. 60 days later, the Navy Fighter Weapons School opened. The world knows it today as Top Gun. Pilots who graduated completely reversed the kill ratios in their squadrons. By the end of the war, Top Gun pilots were shooting down enemies at a ratio of 12 to 1. The rule: a fighter pilot must master close-range, maneuverable combat, regardless of the weaponry equipped on their aircraft. Technology does not replace skill. This rule cost 644 lives before it was finally written down. Story 4. Operation Lam Son 719. Laos, February 1971. American law prohibited U.S. ground forces from crossing the border into Laos, but it didn't prohibit helicopters. That is why Operation Lam Son 719 became a helicopter war. Over 700 choppers from the 101st Airborne Division were tasked with supporting 20,000 South Vietnamese soldiers advancing deep into Laotian territory. The North Vietnamese command knew about the operation in advance. By the time it started, they had amassed between 33,000 and 60,000 troops and over 170 anti-aircraft guns. American helicopters were flying straight into one of the densest air defense zones they had ever encountered. On March 3rd, helicopters were dropping infantry at landing zone Lolo. 11 choppers were shot down and 44 damaged in a single drop. Crews went back for a second run, then a third, because the men on the ground desperately needed reinforcements. Pilots later said they estimated their chances of survival at 50-50. By the end of the operation, the U.S. helicopter fleet had lost over 100 machines. Destroyed and abandoned, hundreds more heavily damaged in Laos. Total U.S. casualties were 1,462. The operation was a massive failure. South Vietnamese forces retreated in panic, soldiers clinging to the outside skids of helicopters, images that shocked the world. The rule: a helicopter operating in an intense enemy fire zone cannot function without anti-aircraft suppression and fighter cover. A transport helicopter over a battlefield is not an airplane. It is slow and vulnerable. Its survival entirely depends on what is done before it even arrives. This rule cost 100 machines and 1,500 men before it was recorded. Story 5. Operation Eagle Claw. Iran, April 24, 1980. President Jimmy Carter authorized a rescue mission after diplomatic negotiations to free 52 American hostages in Tehran hit a dead end. The Operation Eagle Claw was incredibly daring. 8 Marine Corps helicopters were to launch from the USS Nimitz, fly to a staging area in the desert, refuel from Air Force transport planes, and then fly into Tehran the next night to rescue the hostages. But the problem started before they even reached the desert staging area, known as Desert 1. One helicopter turned back due to a rotor blade issue. A second was abandoned in a sandstorm due to hydraulic failure. A third made it to the site, but the crew found a cracked rotor blade, making it unflyable. 6 helicopters were the absolute minimum required for the mission. They only had 5. The mission commander, Colonel Charles Beckwith, requested an abort. Carter gave the green light to cancel. Then, the unthinkable happened. While maneuvering on the ground, in the dark, one of the helicopters crashed into a C-130 transport plane. A massive explosion and fire killed 8 American servicemen. The hostages remained in captivity for another 266 days. The investigation revealed a shocking truth. The helicopter crews and the transport plane crews had never trained together. Not once. The operation required complex coordination between the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force. 3 different branches with different procedures, different signals, and different training. No one had run a joint rehearsal in anything resembling combat conditions. The rule. For any special operation, a joint branch task force must train together for no less than 6 months before execution. Joint rehearsals in realistic conditions are not an option. They are a mandatory element of planning. This disaster directly led to the creation of the United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, in 1970. Story 6. Yom Kippur War. Golan Heights, October 1973. On October 6, 1973, Israeli strike aircraft scrambled to halt a massive Syrian tank offensive on the Golan Heights. The Israeli army had been caught completely off guard on the holiday of Yom Kippur. Most reservists hadn't been mobilized. Only 2 brigades stood against 1,400 Syrian tanks. Aviation was the only thing that could quickly shift the balance. In the very first hours, Israeli pilots ran into Soviet surface-to-air missile systems they had never seen in such numbers. The losses were heavy. But some planes weren't shot down by Syrians, they were shot down by Israelis. In the sheer chaos of the war's opening hours, with radio networks overwhelmed and no one knowing exactly where friendly or enemy lines were, Israeli anti-aircraft crews opened fire on any plane that didn't identify itself fast enough. The IFF system, identify friend or foe, existed, but in the heat of real combat, it suffered from delays and glitches. Several Israeli pilots died from friendly fire. The Egyptians experienced the exact same thing, losing their own planes to their own anti-aircraft artillery. Chaos, speed, and a lack of clear identification procedures proved deadly. The rule. The IFF, identify friend or foe, transponder must always be active on a combat aircraft. Not just when the pilot remembers, not just when there is time. Always. Furthermore, strict air corridors were established for friendly aircraft flying over friendly anti-aircraft zones. Specific sectors, specific times, specific altitudes. Mixing friendly planes and friendly air defenses in the same airspace without strict boundaries is now considered a fatal planning error. Story 7. Black Thursday. Schweinfurt, October 14th, 1943. The American High Command firmly believed in a specific doctrine. A heavy B-17 bomber, bristling with 13 machine guns, could defend itself. A tight formation of hundreds of these flying fortresses would create a zone of fire so dense that no fighter could break through. Escort fighters for deep bombing runs were deemed unnecessary. This was the foundation of the U.S. daylight bombing strategy over Germany. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17s took off for the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany, far beyond the range of Allied escort fighters. Over France, the P-47 escorts reached the edge of their fuel range, tipped their wings goodbye, and turned back. The German fighters were waiting. They had been tracking the American armada since takeoff. The moment the escorts left, the slaughter began. Wave after wave attacked, from the German border to the target and back. The American bombers fired back, the formation held, but it wasn't enough. By that evening, 60 bombers had been shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they were scrapped upon landing. 600 crew members were killed, wounded, or captured, nearly 20 of the entire attacking force. The U.S. 8th Air Force had to halt deep penetration raids into Germany for 5 months. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber formation was officially recognized as a failure. In February 1944, the P-51 Mustang arrived over Germany, a fighter with enough range to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. The rule: a bomber over enemy territory without fighter escort is not a combat unit, it is a target. The range of the escort must equal the range of the strike. This rule remains absolute today. No modern strike operation is planned without calculating fighter cover for the entire route. 60 planes and 600 men paid the price to make this an axiom. Story 8. Battle of Midway. Midway Atoll, June 4th, 1942. At 10:22 a.m., 37 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers dropped out of the clouds over the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet. What they saw below was a miracle that shouldn't happen by the laws of war. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had spent the morning in agonizing indecision. First, he ordered his planes to swap their naval torpedoes for land bombs to strike Midway Island. Then, when reconnaissance reported American ships, he ordered them to switch back to torpedoes. Then back to bombs again. The flight decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were littered with discarded ordnance. Unsecured fuel hoses snaked everywhere. Refueling was happening right on the open flight deck. Planes sat with engines running, ready to take off, surrounded by a mountain of explosives. The first 3 bombs hit their targets in just 6 minutes. Every hit ignited not just the deck, but everything sitting on it. Fuel hoses turned into rivers of fire. Bombs and torpedoes detonated in a massive chain reaction. 3 carriers were engulfed in flames simultaneously. Hours later, all 3 sank to the bottom of the ocean. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk later that evening. Japan lost its 4 best aircraft carriers, over 3,000 men, and 250 elite pilots, men who could not be easily replaced. The rule. Midway burned a new rule into the naval aviation doctrine of every fleet on Earth. Ordnance removed from aircraft must be immediately returned to the magazines. Fuel hoses must be stowed immediately after use. There must be an absolute minimum of unsecured fuel and ammunition on a flight deck at any given moment. Japan broke this rule once. It was enough to cost them the war. Story 9. Black Hawk Down. Mogadishu, October 3rd, 1993. The mission seemed routine. Task Force Ranger, elite U.S. Special Forces comprising Delta Force and the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, was supposed to drop into the center of Mogadishu, capture 2 lieutenants of warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid, and extract. The estimated time? Less than an hour. Black Hawk helicopters loitered over the city at low altitude, providing fire support and coordination. At 4:20 p.m., a militiaman fired an RPG from a rooftop at Black Hawk Super 61. The rocket-propelled grenade, designed to destroy tanks, slammed into the tail rotor. The helicopter spun out of control and crashed into the city streets. Both pilots died. 20 minutes later, a second Black Hawk was shot down. Adid's fighters had figured out the American tactics. The helicopters were flying the same routes repeatedly at the same low altitude, about 80 to 100 meters. At that height, a crude RPG could easily reach them. American soldiers spent the entire night holding off thousands of militia members around the two crash sites until an armored convoy arrived. 18 Americans died, 73 were wounded. The rule. After Mogadishu, helicopter tactics changed in all future conflicts. Combat helicopters do not loiter at a constant low altitude over an active fire zone. Altitude, speed, and flight paths must change continuously. A predictable helicopter is a dead helicopter. This rule was strictly applied in Iraq, Afghanistan, and every operation since. 18 men paid for it to be written down. Story 10. Operation Cobra. Normandy, July 25th, 1944. General Omar Bradley personally flew to London to convince the Strategic Bomber Command of a daring idea. Heavy B-17 and B-24 bombers would carpet bomb German positions near St. Lo, blowing a hole in the defense line, and American divisions would pour through the gap. It was called Operation Cobra. Bradley had one strict condition. The bombers had to make their approach parallel to the front line so that no bombs would accidentally fall on American troops. Air Command refused. A parallel approach took too long and exposed the heavy bombers to too much anti-aircraft fire. They insisted on flying perpendicular to the front line. Bradley later admitted he didn't fully understand what this meant in practice. On July 25th, over 1,500 bombers approached the target. The dust and smoke from the first wave of explosions rose high over the battlefield. The following waves of bombers used that smoke as their targeting marker, dropping their payload exactly where the smoke was coming from. But the wind was blowing the smoke north, and north meant backwards, right over the positions of the 30th and 9th American Infantry Divisions. 111 American soldiers were killed by their own bombers. Nearly 500 were wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the commander of Army Ground Forces, the highest-ranking officer on that section of the front. A bomb scored a direct hit on his foxhole, throwing his body 20 meters. He was only identified by the 3 stars on his collar. General Eisenhower, who was in Normandy that day, returned to headquarters devastated and vowed never to use heavy bombers for tactical ground support again. The rule. The safety zone between the front edge of friendly troops and the bomb release point must be established exclusively in writing, signed by both air and ground commanders. The approach route must be negotiated separately. No verbal agreements. General Bradley thought they heard him. They didn't. 111 men paid for that misunderstanding. Thank you so much for watching, for your support, and your comments. We will continue to improve our content and grow. Have a great day.